Welcome to Listenwise News Bites, where you can hear stories from the news that are specially selected for young listeners. I'm Monica Brady-Meyerov, a public radio reporter and the founder of Listenwise, an award-winning online listening resource used by teachers. We have a curated collection of more than 2,000 podcasts from sources such as NPR and other producers of high-quality audio storytelling. In this episode, we hear about how to reopen schools safely, and we get a view of the Earth from space. And in weird news, you'll learn why a dirty, used pair of sneakers sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. First, a story I know you must be interested in, whether or not you'll be going back to school in person in the fall.
Parents, teachers, and school officials face an agonizing choice in the next few weeks. How, if at all, do they send their kids back to school? To them, it's a decision about public health and about the kids who are closest to them. The president alleges the decision is really about him. He's urging schools to open and criticizing his own administration's guidelines for opening safely and claiming without evidence that governors and school leaders want to keep schools shut to hurt him.
They think it's going to be good for them politically, so they keep the schools closed. No way. So we're very much going to put pressure on governors and everybody else to open the schools, to get them open.
District leaders in Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, and many other communities have announced they will keep teaching remotely when school resumes. NPR's Corey Turner has been covering this and joins us now. Corey, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
I want to mention that the White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, said behind the lectern yesterday, science should not stand in the way of reopening. Now, people mock that as if she was dismissing science, but in context, she appeared to be arguing that the science supports reopening. That's what she said, but what does the research actually say?
Yeah, that's right. The science suggests that kids generally don't get very sick from COVID-19. So the administration's not far on that one. But it is less clear how easily kids spread it, especially if they're clustered in schools. But we have to remember that the real issue here is that many states are right now seeing substantial community spread of the disease. And the science is not clear that reopening schools in that context is smart or safe. As for that CDC guidance you mentioned, Steve, our colleague Franco Ordonez reported last night that the agency is going to delay some new school reopening documents. Although it's a little confusing here because CDC has said these documents are not a revision or a softening of the old guidance that President Trump doesn't like, just sort of an elaboration.
Oh, that's right, because the president criticized the guidelines as too tough, and the CDC essentially said, too bad, the science is what it is, these are the guidelines. So what would make the guidelines contentious?
I mean, some of them are really tough, having kids wear face coverings, staggering school schedules, but maybe the hardest is keeping kids 6 feet apart in the classroom. You know, do the math. To do that, you A, have to divide kids into smaller classroom groups, B, find more classroom space, and C, find more teachers. And that's tough. And that's why some places like New York City say they're going to have to do a hybrid schedule, bringing some kids in some of the time.
What are various school superintendents saying as they make these decisions?
So they're saying that, you know, in spite of President Trump trying to sideline the CDC, they are still very much working with and listening to local, state, and federal public health officials. Ann Levette, she heads the Savannah-Chatham County Public Schools in Georgia. She told me she's constantly checking in with the head of her public health department and looking over daily infection data for her community.
Every day I look at the numbers and I'm like, please let them go down. Please let them go down. And they're not going down.
Which is why Levette says her hardest day in this pandemic was not when Georgia closed her schools back in March. It was just last week when, looking at the numbers, she decided there was just no way for her to fully reopen. At roughly the same time as when President Trump began his campaign to pressure school leaders into quickly reopening, accusing them of not doing what's best for kids.
Anyone out there who's questioning whether or not educators are at home and not doing the work that our young people need us to be doing, they're wrong.
That's Louvel Brown. He's head of the Ithaca City School District in Ithaca, New York.
We're working even more now, and we can't wait to get these babies back in our spaces.
Superintendents do at least share President Trump's sense of urgency.
It is better to have kids back in school every day.
Paul Imhoff is the superintendent of Upper Arlington Schools near Columbus, Ohio.
All of us want that. All of us are anxious for that.
But then Imhoff pauses.
As soon as it's safe.
Michael Hinojosa, who runs the Dallas Independent School District, puts it this way.
Sometimes parents forgive us if we commit educational malpractice. They will never forgive us if we let something happen to their children.
So what does it mean to open schools safely? Many school leaders are following CDC's recommendation to space desks 6 feet apart, and Brown says that's forcing him to get creative.
We'll use every one of our spaces. We hope to be able to get outside and use those spaces as well. But I still don't think we can get all of our young people in school at the same time.
In Dallas, Michael Hinojosa says,
we think we can have a pretty safe learning environment, but we're going to have masks. We're going to have face shields. We're going to have plexiglass in the classroom.
The plexiglass, he says, helps him fit more students into each classroom. Even with that, though, Dallas County is seeing substantial community spread of the disease. So Hinojosa says he wants to delay the start of school by several weeks. Chad Geston, the head of the Phoenix Union High School District, says this pandemic is forcing educators to become epidemiologists.
We were spending so much time studying respiratory droplets and measuring classrooms and how many kids fit on a bus and how to transition thousands of kids between periods that we lost track of the core of our work.
And that core, Geston says, is teaching and learning. So, Steve, with infection rates skyrocketing in Arizona too, Geston recently announced that, for now at least, all of his students are going to keep learning remotely. And that way, he says, he and his staff can get back to focusing on, how to be a great school.
Well, it sounds like the bottom line is that many schools, maybe even most schools, will not open on time in August or the start of September.
At least not fully, no. I think there's just too much uncertainty, especially with infection rates rising again in so many places. It's also worth noting, though, that several recent national polls show a majority of parents really oppose schools rushing to reopen, too. Parents are on the side of schools in many places. I even heard from the superintendent in Ithaca, where infection rates are pretty low. Superintendent Brown told me, the key to everyone being able to return to school there really boils down to one word: vaccine.
Yeah, and if you have different schools making different decisions in different areas, you have parents looking around and saying, wait a minute, what are we supposed to do here? And wanting to be cautious with their own kids, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it gets back to the same old line I've heard every day since covering schools, which is they're controlled locally.
Corey, thanks for your work.
Thank you, Steve.
Hearing this story makes me think about how keeping kids 6 feet apart in the classroom is going to be really hard. What ideas do you have for keeping schools safe during a pandemic? Next, a story about seeing Earth from a different perspective: space.
A few weeks ago, 2 astronauts lifted off from U.S. soil.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
Bob and Doug were on a SpaceX rocket. It's the first time a private company has carried astronauts into full orbit. Colonel Doug Hurley and Colonel Bob Behnken are now on the International Space Station, which is where we connected with them last week. How's the view?
When we get a chance to look out the window, it's spectacular. I can't begin to describe some of the sights that you get to see, the sunrises, the sunsets. If you sat in the cupola for 45 minutes and you had a rough day, it would immediately wash it all away. It's just an incredible view of our planet that we have from here.
How is going into space now different than it was half a century ago?
If you go back to the earlier missions, the Apollo timeframe, the team on the ground did quite a bit of manual computation to ensure that the subtle burns that needed to happen with the engines on board the vehicle to end up at the right landing site. We have the luxury of having much of that all on board our vehicle, and so it was able to get all the way to space station pretty much by itself, and we monitored to make sure that that was happening safely.
So you're in much more of a self-driving car. Is that a fair analogy?
We're in a self-driving car with a lot of capability to make sure that we agree with what it's decided to do.
What did it mean for you that you went up in a privately owned spacecraft?
From a personal standpoint, the opportunity to work on a brand new vehicle and fly on the first test flight of a brand new vehicle was just something that comes along once in a generation. So, when we were offered the opportunity to participate, obviously we wouldn't say no.
Do you talk among yourselves about what the possibilities might be 10 or 20 years from now because of some of the work you're doing now?
I think we talk amongst ourselves in terms of what the possibilities might even be next year or 3 years from now. We look at the reuse that SpaceX has done with the first stage rockets that they have. It's opened up the door for missions to be launched that would be prohibitively expensive if you were to use another method for getting the vehicle into space. As the cost goes down, then really those opportunities will open up for other folks to fly on those vehicles. I think you'll still need somebody trained to go with them, and much like if you were to go scuba diving, you can be trained and go, but you want to go with somebody who's got some skills and some experience.
Gentlemen, final question. Do you get a chance to follow the news from home, and does it feel different from the distance that you're at to be following it?
It's tough to see the world kind of in the state it's in right now from here. It's difficult to see the challenges that we're facing with the strife in the cities and with the pandemic. And then just by virtue of being able to look out the window, you see the world with no borders up here. And that does resonate with you. And hopefully that message can get back down to earth that, we need to be able to work together for the common good and not work against each other and argue all the time over things that shouldn't be argued about.
That story came from NPR. The astronauts went to the space station on a private rocket, and that could make it possible for more people to travel in space. Do you think this is a good idea? Why or why not? And now it's time for some weird news. Would you pay $500,000 for sneakers?
Good morning, I'm Noelle King. A pair of old sneakers brought in $560,000 at an auction over the weekend. Not just any shoes, they're Michael Jordan's personal pair of 1985 Air Jordans. Sotheby's sold them for more than 3 times the price that was expected, probably because there's no way they could be mistaken for anyone's but Jordan's. He signed them in permanent marker, and thanks to his unusual feat, the right shoe is half a size bigger than the left.
Thanks to our partner NPR and to Scott Holmes for our theme music. That's it for the Listenwise News Bites podcast this week. For more stories from the news selected for young listeners, go to www.listenwise.com and sign up for free. And subscribe to this podcast for our weekly shows. Happy listening.